All right. Well, good morning to those of you who, like me, are in the East Coast in the United States, and good afternoon to those calling in from the EU, and good evening if there are those who are even further into their February 4th than that. We are very excited to be talking to you all. My name is Ramya Ravi Shankar. I am the General Counsel at HowGood over here. I've been the head of the legal function for several years now at HowGood. And in my capacity as general counsel, I wear many hats, one of which is understanding and decoding the regulatory landscape around uh, all relevant laws that pertain to our business here at HowGood, and particularly all laws and regulations that touch on the ESG space. Um, Unsurprisingly, we've had a lot of appetite for today's topic, CSRD in 2025, the Food Industry Guide for Compliance and Beyond. And we're really excited to delve in further. But before I get into that, a brief introduction on HowGood. You're going to hear a lot more from some of our other speakers, like Joao Britz, who is the Director of Growth and Innovation at HowGood, about HowGood's various offerings. But at a high level, HowGood has been around for almost 20 years. We are a software platform and we provide data and insights to the food industry pertaining to ESG and how various impacts and decisions that companies make in their supply chain can translate into relevant changes with respect to things like their carbon footprint, their water footprint, impacts on biodiversity, you name it. And we have specialized in the food industry in part because of the complexities that you all understand are unique to the food industry. And that industry expertise has led to us being partners with some of the world's largest food brands and suppliers. Anyway, the agenda for today, if we can move to the next slide, Joao. We'll first talk about the current state of the ESG regulatory landscape writ large. I'll look both at the EU, certainly, but also globally. I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions, especially given the changes coming out of Washington, D.C. We will then look at the trends to watch in 2025, how our business is preparing, what are some predictions that we have given our expertise and our observations on the ground. We'll look at CSRD certainly and do a little bit of a deeper dive on its requirements and some of the challenges that may be ahead. And then, of course, I'll talk about mitigating risk and the kind of next steps that companies can consider, especially as deadlines and timelines are accelerating with each passing day. And then I'll pass it over to my colleague Joao to talk a little bit more in depth about HowGood and some of the reporting solutions that HowGood can help with as you think about your compliance journey. All right. So, and then of course, we'll have time for questions, hopefully, and we can engage in a discourse around any of the topics that are top of mind for you all. Okay, Joao, if you can take us to the next slide. So let's talk about the state of the ESG landscape. Oh, yeah, thank you. The state of the ESG landscape more generally. Um, no matter what you've been hearing or reading, ESG is not going away anytime soon. ESG regulation was on an accelerated path the last couple of years, and that regulation is largely here to stay, both in the United States and abroad, even though there will be, some bumps along the way. There's going to be some uncertainties, some pulling back, some acceleration, depending on the regulatory priorities of the countries that are implementing these rules. And separate and apart from the regulatory environment, on the voluntary side, you are seeing a continued appetite from stakeholders like investors and consumers who want ESG-related data and information from the companies that they are either invested in or buying from. So in 2025, we're expecting another year of significant evolution for companies as they adjust to meet the various compliance requirements that are coming into place, as well as as they adjust to a more sophisticated stakeholder group. Just as ESG regulation is here to stay in some form of another, you are continuing to see anti-ESG sentiment and backlash, and that's not going to go away either. So you're having this push-pull that's going to continue to play itself out. And as we saw in 2024, just because anti-ESG has sort of accelerated in the US doesn't mean it has stayed there. We're going to continue to see such sentiment piping up in other parts of the world, both organically and endemically, but also in response to some of the updates and challenges coming out of the US. For example, in Europe, we're starting to see, the anti-ESG movement continue to gain strength. But unlike in the United States, where the debate has largely been over the legitimacy of whether ESG is worth considering, in Europe, the debate's a little bit more nuanced. It's more about the appropriate balance between economic concerns and environmental or human rights concerns. So it's not whether ESG as a concept, as a binary, is good or bad. It's more how we're thinking about the various components that play into ESG and how to weight those various components. So as you all think about these push-pull factors and you're thinking about how you respond to these pressures, as proactive business partners, one of the things you should be thinking about is having the frameworks in place to meet these challenges. So even if it is a more toned down regulatory environment in which you're going to be operating, ensuring you have the infrastructure in place to address those requirements as they evolve. We're seeing more jurisdictions adopt climate disclosure requirements. Those requirements are largely still aligned with the International Sustainability Standards Board's climate disclosure standards. And we're also seeing a new acronym crop up in the space, and that is EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility Requirements. Said another way, we're starting to see a lot more attention being placed on companies' supply chains, their producers' impacts, which then rolls into their own overall footprints. This EPR requirement we're seeing take up more real estate, both in the United States and Europe, and I'm expecting it'll continue to gain momentum globally. And then, of course, part and parcel with this is the rise in greenwashing litigation and enforcement. We're going to continue to see a lot of attention in this space. In the United States, of course, the updated green guides are still waiting to be released. Timelines on that are probably a little longer now that there's a change in administration. But we're seeing in the UK, we're seeing in the EU, greater enforcement and greater scrutiny around greenwashing. So being mindful of that is also something we need to think about. Of course, in the EU, the CSRD will be the biggest ESG focus in terms of the sheer number of hours and budget and the timelines that are coming into place. But the EU deforestation regulation and other EU sustainability regulations are also on companies' minds. And we're expecting, and I'm sure everyone's waiting for us to talk about this, I'm expecting changes in these regulations through this omnibus proposal that people are talking about to consolidate the various requirements companies have to meet. So what is this omnibus? Late last year, there was indication in the EU that there might be an effort to tailor the CSRD requirements, the CSDDD requirements, and the taxonomy regulation to have one set of proposals that companies have to adhere to. The proposal timeline right now is actually at the end of February. There was some versions that have come out already that have been leaked. I'm sure many of you have been eagerly perusing that. But it largely looks like the climate change aspect of these regulations will remain in place. But the changes are probably going to be around the size of companies that need to comply and the timelines in which they need to start complying. So as far as ESG proponents like us are considering this, the changes don't look as drastic as we may have feared, but this extended phase-in period and this scaling back of some of the non-climate change requirements suggests that there might be, less investment in some of these substantive areas at the outset, but it's not going away forever. As time goes on, we would expect that, things like biodiversity and some of the other features will get phased in. If you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in terms of what to watch in 2025, given the state of the ESG landscape, as I mentioned, this isn't going away altogether. So if you are not a first actor and you've been waiting to see how things play out, that caution might have been helpful when reporting deadlines hadn't come into the forefront. But now, as things get closer, it is clearer to companies that there will be investor and consumer pressure to focus on ESG. And when you're focusing on things like long-term value creation, sustainable investments in your business will allow you to continue to drive business along in a positive manner. Regulatory compliance is going to be a bigger part of ESG budgets and compliance budgets more generally, and we're certainly going to see that in 2025. And as the budget expands, so is headcount. We're expecting in 2025 to see not just sustainability professionals engaged in this endeavor, but we're going to see more finance professionals, lawyers, data analysts, and other multi-stakeholder groups at companies playing a part in understanding the corporate footprints, mitigation efforts, and goal-setting initiatives. So, from my perspective, as I talk to customers, as I talk to businesses that are thinking ahead about what is coming down the pipe, it is very clear that managing ESG risk and legal risk around it will be a shared responsibility across these various functions. And we're going to have a lot of crosstalk where we're going to need compliance professionals that are more fluent in the language of reporting frameworks and sustainability standards, and you're going to need sustainability professionals more fluent in the compliance frameworks, legal frameworks, so that there is real alignment on priorities and efforts. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So all this is to say, the focus of today's conversation really is CSRD. What does it involve, and what are some of the challenges that are facing companies as they prepare to comply? So the CSRD is a vast sweeping regulation coming out of the EU, directing corporate sustainability reporting. It impacts large companies and listed small and medium enterprises operating in the EU. And by initial counts, about 50,000 entities have been identified as affected by this regulation. And the way European laws are designed, the EU sets out this mandate through its directive, and then member states transpose those directives into their national legal systems. And we have seen now more than 20 member states in the EU have come up with their own versions accommodating the directive, and some have gone above and beyond what the directive requires, where they've set even tighter standards or tighter eligibility requirements and reporting requirements. So it really is a car that, or a vehicle that has been set in motion. And it is companies' responsibility to keep track of how they comply in the various member states that they're operating, that is aligned with those member states' interpretations and implementations of the directive. The CSRD uses the European Sustainability Reporting Standards Framework, and this framework identifies various areas to report out onto, whether it's climate change, pollution, water and marine resources, biodiversity, social standards, governance, you name it. And when I talked about this omnibus that is being promoted out of the EU to consolidate the CSRD, it is focused on reducing some of the bureaucracy and some of the the complexity that comes from reporting out on some of these other categories of reports. However, climate change remains top of mind for key stakeholders. So we believe that that is still something that companies need to focus on and think about when they're looking at their compliance strategy. Um, Climate change, in terms of what the requirements that the ESRS poses, has various narrative components in terms of how the company is thinking about its climate mitigation strategies, or how it's thinking about its internal policies, and their adaptation timelines, what kind of resources that they're allocating to implement some of these changes, and so forth. And it also has a lot of metrics focused and numerical reporting requirements. For example, their targets, specific numeric targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, their energy consumption mix, what kind of numbers are we talking with respect to energy consumed from renewable sources versus non-renewable sources, metrics around their scopes 1, 2, and 3 reporting. And it is in this context that certainly engaging their supply chain is going to be really crucial, because scope 3 impacts are so tied up with a company's upstream partners and suppliers. There is additional requirements around internal carbon pricing, how internal carbon pricing mechanisms are used to incentivize emission reductions. What are some of the potential financial effects from the efforts that the company is initiating to reduce carbon impacts? And there's a few others, but the point is there is a large metrics component of the climate change section of the ESRS framework, a lot of which can be calculated through internal stakeholder cooperation at companies. All these categories of reports still have to meet what the CSRD sets out as the double materiality requirement. What I mean by that is, first, around impact materiality, how these various initiatives and operations at the company affect the environment and society. And second, financial materiality, how sustainability factors affect the company's performance. You can almost think of it as like an inside out approach and an outside in approach. What I mean by that is the impact materiality is an inside out approach, how your internal operations affect the environment more generally. And then an outside in approach, how external sustainability factors affect your financial performance as a company. In order to meet all of these requirements, companies, as I've mentioned, need to engage their suppliers. They need to ensure that the data that they need to calculate all of these metrics are available. They have the right partners in place to verify that the data is accurate, that they have assurance and auditing services in place. Because the CSRD requires what is considered limited assurance. They need an auditor to be able to review the data that is being submitted and conclude that there is no information to suggest there's a material misstatement or some sort of issue. This is, of course, a lower threshold of assurance than reasonable assurance. As the CSRD matures and as companies grow in size, there is more rigorous assurance standards that are being planned and they're planning to phase in. But at the outset, limited assurance is the standard that reporting companies need to meet, which is, the kind of assurance that you can work in tandem with your reporting approach to ensure you're not missing large gaps. In terms of timelines, the reason we are all here, the reason we are all closely watching all of this, is that the earliest timelines are kicking off this year for operations in financial year 2024. This affects large companies. And then as time goes on, next year, there's going to be reporting requirements for smaller companies with either 40 million of revenue of 40 million euros in revenue in the in Europe, or that have 20 million euros worth of assets, or that have 250 plus employees. And then as time goes on, listed smaller companies will need to report out in 2027 and so forth. But since we're talking about 2025, we're focused most imminently on these large companies that have had operations in the EU. If you can go to the next slide, please. So how do we think about these challenges and these issues around data and engaging suppliers? I would say, the critical component, if you don't already have structures in place, is to start thinking about some sort of governance framework and committee where you have ESG as part of your corporate strategy itself, where you've got not just the sustainability professionals on your teams that are thinking about this, but you really have those lawyers, those finance professionals, data analysts, management teams, engaged and understanding what existential changes your company needs to take into account, and what kind of investments it needs to make so that the compliance for these directives is not an afterthought. You want to have the right technology partners in place, whether that is, the right data collection partners, the right software vendors, the right reporting vendors, or in the case of HowGood, we're able to do all three. And I'm sure Joao can tell you more about that. But the point is, you really want to make sure you're making those investments, you're planning your budgets around those investments early, so that it's not something that you have to speed up and accelerate and do as an afterthought again, as the reporting deadline comes closer. For food companies in particular, when you are looking at technology vendors, you want to ensure that the vendors are accommodating for the various quirks that accompany food processing and growing. Is the data that they are able to leverage location specific? Does it allow for granular adjustments? Does it only look at averages, or does it take in primary data from suppliers? Is the information that they are relying on to calculate these footprints peer reviewed and updated frequently? You want to do your diligence to ensure that your technology partners understand that a food company is not the same as an industrial manufacturer or a chemicals company or a pharmaceutical company or what have you. So you want to really vet and ensure that the process for calculating these various impacts are tailored to the way your operations actually are on the ground. And then you want to talk to your supply chain, right? Agriculture is the oldest industry in the world. You've got really complex supply chains and partners that vary in their sophistication level. So identifying and mapping out what your supply chain looks like and understanding what the gaps are in terms of data reporting, because you use smallhold farmers and they don't really track things in the same way that your industrial partners do or what have you. It's helpful to get a snapshot of that so that you're able to standardize inputs from across the supply chain so that your reporting rolls out to be more accurate. You want to check and do diligence on your larger company partners in terms of aligning on the ESG frameworks they're using. Are those frameworks compatible with what you're planning to use? Are you able to create efficiencies and economies of scale where if one of your subsidiaries is already reporting out on some of this or is collecting this data, can that roll up to your parent? But you won't know where to start until you start talking to your supply chain, and you're able to leverage those efficiencies as time goes on. In terms of the short term, now that I've shared all the various pieces of this, things that you can start doing if you already have these stakeholders in place, you're already having the tech stack in place, and you're already having your supply chain in place, is start by doing a double materiality assessment and understand where there is issues that trigger that financial materiality threshold or that impact materiality threshold. Identify gaps in those practices and start aligning your improvement plans with the ESRS framework that the EU CSRD has adopted. Then start developing a roadmap for data collection and assurance. In terms of longer term processes, As I've mentioned, you really want ESG to be embedded within the larger corporate strategy of the company. And for that, you need executive buy-in and you need board buy-in. And you want to ensure that you are revisiting and continually improving the processes around ESG management and compliance. I will turn it over to my colleague Joao to talk a little bit more about how HowGood can specifically assist with some of this. And then we will hopefully have time at the end for some questions. I know the chat's been quite active, and I will use some of this time to start looking at what you're all interested in so I can be more informed in our conversation going forward. Joao, over to you.
Thank you for that great overview, Ramya, and hello, everybody. My name is João Brito. I am Director of Growth and Innovation at HowGood. I'm based out of the beautiful city of Madrid in the European Union, where I actually spend most of my time talking about CSRD to various companies in the European Union, and talking about CSRD not just from a perspective of a compliance play, but also kind of really giving the next step, which is about how do we transform the CSRD compliance play into an opportunity to build a competitive advantage for a food business. And I think that's also kind of where a lot of interesting things come up. So I'm going to start by kind of telling you a little bit more about HowGood CSRD reporting solution. And then on the second part, before the Q&A, I will share some of the strategies and some of the mind shifts and the mindsets that companies have been using to approach the CSRD opportunity as I like to see it. So regarding kind of, HowGood's reporting suite, as Ramya mentioned, HowGood has been a research company and sustainability intelligence software. We've been around for 18 years, and we've really built a very solid position as the premier climate data provider for the food industry. So good climate data for both your scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, even in connection to other voluntary standards like FLAG, is really important. But what is it that we mean by good data? The first thing is accurate emissions factors, right? You will see that you can very quickly go to a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 calculator in the internet, and you can get a rough spend-based figure of your footprint relatively quickly. But, as many things in life, details really do matter. We've seen that granular emissions factors allow you to be much more precise, much more specific, much more accurate, so that when you're not only reporting your ESG data, but also when you are at the point of understanding your decarbonization scenario and your transition plan, you're able to make much more informed decisions. So by accuracy, we mean that you're able to really evaluate the footprint of the actual products that you're buying with a minimum use of proxies or generalizations. It means that your emissions factors and your impact factors in general are as granular as they possibly can be, particularly for your most material ingredients. So if you as a company source a lot of corn and sell a lot of corn-based products, it's going to be around corn where you really want to be as granular as possible and get agricultural data as granular as possible to make sure that you direct your measurement efforts to the categories that are the most material to you. And last but not least, you also want to create the opportunity to engage suppliers. In addition of working at HowGood, I'm also a small-scale farmer. I run a community farm in Madrid. And one thing I know as a small-scale farmer is that how we grow ingredients, how we farm makes a huge difference to the final footprint of a product, right? The type of tillage that I do, my applications of fertilizer or herbicide or pesticide, if I work with animals, the type of manure management systems, the type of feed that I use. And we know here at HowGood that an emissions factor for the same ingredient can vary more than 50x depending on where you grow it and how you grow it. So farms and farming practices really matter. Never forget that. And so we've been investing for 18 years at HowGood to build a software and a solution that would enable our partners to automate a lot of the work on around sustainability reporting. I like to see HowGood as a little bit of like the sidekick of sustainability professionals like yourselves. And our role is really to automate as much of the burdensome data integration, data analysis work that you need to do so that you can focus on the things that really matter, which is, driving impact, meeting your ambitious targets, engaging your suppliers and engaging your customers in the process. So right now, HowGood offers a CSRD reporting solution focused around climate, where you're able to measure your Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, including alignment with voluntary standards like FLAG. You're able to also calculate and create scenarios for your climate transition plan, particularly for companies who've adopted science-based targets or who've committed to climate neutrality by 2040 or 2045 or 2050. Whatever your timeline is, you need a really good system that gives you the data you need to understand how you can get there. And HowGood provides you that for GHG emissions. So you can very quickly export CSRD compliant and flag aligned Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 report. And you're also able to model the impact of sustainability initiatives, of sourcing changes, reformulations with instant clarity. And so this means that you're able to understand, okay, what if I was to shift my, what if I was going to introduce reduced tillage in my tomato farms? Or what if I changed my sourcing of soybean from Brazil to the US? Or what happens if I replace cane sugar in a specific formulation by beet sugar or coconut sugar or maple syrup? And so all of these are types of decisions that you can make with data at your fingertips instantly using our system. And one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is that you can do this not only for yourselves, but also provide your suppliers with a network and a tool that enables them to do the same so that you can benefit, but also their other customers can benefit too. And so you're able to understand which of your suppliers have set science-based targets, what types of targets that they've submitted, what are the emissions of the products that they sell to you? What is the water footprint? What is the land footprint? You can even see other metrics such as labor risk and deforestation risk. And finally, all of HowGood, we've been very intentional about building the integrations with other solutions providers. CSRD is so broad and so encompassing that it is very difficult for any given software or service provider by itself solve all of your CSRD reporting needs. So it's a little bit like, in farming, when you're thinking about the consortiums of plants that you want to grow together. In this case, it's a little bit about, okay, what is the consortium of solutions that I want to bring together to support me in my CSRD requirements? And so this is why HowGood allows you to integrate the climate change aspect on the CSRD reporting solutions of other software providers such as Watershed, Salesforce, Workiva, IBM, Microsoft, and many others, so that you have the benefit of the best and most granular climate data, regardless of the software that you use. Finally, I've spent a little bit of time talking about, the compliance aspect and how HowGood hopefully can automate and ease some of that process for you. But I think where things really get exciting is when we challenge and invite ourselves and our colleagues within our companies to think, is CSRD only a compliance play? Or is there a deeper opportunity for us to surf this wave and create a sustained competitive advantage for a business? I believe in the latter for many companies. And so what I'm going to share with you is a couple of reframes of how we've seen companies positioning and approaching CSRD. And the compliance-based reframe is not wrong, right? If it is the decision of your company to, do the CSRD for just compliance motives, that's great. But that doesn't have to be that way. You can also use CSRD to build a sustained competitive advantage. And so if that's the case and you're curious, we're going to see some examples of how you can do that. So the first one, the first reframe is really about who is responsible for CSRD. And when we think about a kind of a more of a compliance-based play, we tend to think of companies that have kind of placed the responsibility or the burden of CSRD under a chief legal officer, who then galvanizes other business functions with the data that they need to fulfill this specific reporting requirement. And so you can see here, it's a chief legal officer is kind of galvanizing things. Now, on the right-hand side, you see kind of a little bit of how other companies have been positioning the CSRD as a competitive advantage. And you see them putting the responsibility of CSRD under, for example, the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. And why, to Ramya's point, there is this movement to integrate financial and non-financial data in an integrated annual report that is subject to assurance like financial data is in many aspects. And so why not using this opportunity to integrate a key business function across your business to have the responsibility of integrating this data? And what we see is that the companies that do this are much better at seeing how sustainability risks, water risks, climate risks impact the bottom line of the business and its ability to operate for the years to come. Now, where are you? How are you thinking about who's holding the responsibility of CSRD at your company, right? And what is your choice? So let's move to the reframe number 2. The reframe number 2 is really about who do you do the CSRD for? And from a compliance perspective, usually we see companies saying, look, CSRD is complicated enough. I'm going to do CSRD for myself and for my company. And I'm going to ask my suppliers for the data that I need to fulfill my reporting obligations. And again, that's fine. That's already a lot of work. But when we look at it from a competitive advantage, we see some of the companies saying that, well, we do CSRD not only for ourselves, but also for our customers. Because chances are that your customers, if you're struggling with CSRD, if the CSRD, some aspects of it have been difficult for you, chances are that for your customers too. And what we see is that more and more customers are looking for suppliers that are CSRD ready. And for example, we've seen a bunch of CPG food companies already in the space introducing a mandatory requirement in all of their requests for proposals to provide Scope 3 data associated with the products that they sell to that CPG. And so your ability to help your customer fulfilling their CSRD obligations can also become a competitive advantage for you. So again, where are you, right? Who do you want to solve CSRD for? Now, reframe number 3. So the reframe number 3 is about what do you report? And so CSRD, the name says it all, right? It's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It's corporate reporting. And so from a compliance perspective, what you are required to report is really around kind of your corporate metrics and your targets. These can be things like your Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions, your carbon intensity, your policies around specific aspects of workers in the value chain or your own workers. Now, what we see is that companies that are looking at this from a competitive advantage lens are not only reporting corporate metrics and targets, but they're also seeing the opportunity to report product level metrics and their impact. Because they've started realizing that in order to often report aggregate figures, they need to have very good granular product level data. And if you're putting all of that investment in sustainability analysts, in sustainability solutions and software to calculate those product given metrics, why not leveraging all of that investment into something that you can report to your customer at the product level? And one of my personal favorite examples of this is Ingredion. Ingredion has been a partner of HowGood for a handful of years now. And you can see in this example how in their communications to customers, they're now able to say, look, if you change a whey protein concentrate by our product, the pea protein isolate, you would get a 6% reduction in your blue water footprint, a 47% reduction in the carbon footprint. And so they're not just talking about the corporate ingredient scope 1, ingredient scope 2, ingredient scope 3. They're actually able to talk about the product that they're selling, the footprint, and even more than that, the impact that that ingredient has on a customer formulation. And that's where you can really shift the needle and move from a compliance play into competitive advantage. So again, take a second to think, where are you now, right? Are you really focused on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3? Are you able to report product level footprints? If a customer asks you about product footprint data, are you able to respond? How quickly and to how many footprints? Now, reframe number 4. Where is your data? So when we operate from a compliance play, sometimes what we see is that companies having a dedicated sustainability software or a dedicated sustainability folder with all of their sustainability data, but that doesn't really communicate with the other ERPs within the company. So you can see here on the left-hand side, sustainability data is a little bit of an island that does not really communicate to financial data, operational data, procurement data, and R&D data. And we see that companies that are able to translate this into competitive advantage, they're really thinking about, okay, how can I make sure that my sustainability data is structured in a way that can easily flow to my financial data systems or my operational data systems or my R&D data or procurement data. So for example, if your formulators are using a software for formulation, why not having sustainability data feeding into that formulation software so that they can keep using the formulation software that they love, maybe that they built in-house, but with the additional benefit of very granular sustainability data. So really think, to Ramya's point around, one of your short-term priorities being around, like, how do we create these ecosystem for data within your company and how do you prepare for the data requirements? Really think from the outset, how will your data fly to these other systems and integrate the decision-making processes of other folks? And finally, the reframe number 5. And it's really like when we operate from a more of a compliance perspective, we're really focused on, okay, I'm going to have a CSRD compliant annual report, that's it. And if I hit that goalpost, we were successful. Now, what happens if you were to think about how you can use all of that CSRD data that you've worked so hard for to drive measurable return on investment for your company? And so we've seen examples, for example, where companies are tying the interest rate on their bonds, particularly something called the green bonds, to the attainment of specific sustainability targets. And so if you're able to do this, then hitting the sustainability target and your sustainability data, it doesn't become necessary just for a CSRD compliance reason, but actually becomes an instrument to reduce the cost of capital of your business. Or, for example, around customer preference, right? If you're able to have product level data, are you able to have product level sustainability claims to share with your final consumers the work that you're doing on sustainability and hopefully attract some of the growing share of consumers that care about sustainability and the products that they buy? And last, for example, on supply chain risk, right? If you're able to better understand, for example, climate risk and how climate risk will impact the crops that you rely on and their prices, you're also able to protect your supply chain for business continuity. And many of you saw, for example, very recently, there's been a lot of volatility, for example, with cocoa prices driven by many factors, including disruptions to weather in Western Africa. And so if you're able to understand how climate risks will impact the bottom line and financial risks for your company, not only today, but in 3, 5 years to come, you're able to prepare and reduce financial risk. So these are some examples of how you can go from, just, check the box, produce a CSRD compliant report and put it in your website, into thinking more deeply about what does the data in your CSRD report do for your company. And the truth is, this sometimes might look difficult when, some of you might think, look, just doing a CSRD compliant report is already kind of difficult. I can't even think about, how to build a competitive advantage out of it. And, what we've seen is that many companies are already being able to integrate that mindset from the beginning. For example, with Chartwells, where they use a software that is shared by both R&D, procurement, and marketing and sustainability, so that everyone is making decisions that impact sustainability based on the same level of underlying data. And the same thing with Kerry, the Kerry Group. It's an Irish CPG company and ingredient supplier who has the ambition for climate neutrality. And their goal is really about building a world of sustainable nutrition. And so without sustainability data, they're not able to fulfill their promise to their most important customers, which is giving them ingredient solutions that are both nutritious and sustainable. So with that said, we're going to go into the Q&A. We have Ramya, Liz, and myself, and I'll hand over to Ramya.
Thank you, Joao. I'm really excited. The conversation's quite engaging, and I know we're going to go over time. I think one of our colleagues mentioned in the chat, but we are here to stay a few minutes late if there continue to be questions, and we'll also follow up offline to many of you who have raised questions that we don't get time to address. So the first one I'll take, there was a question around the timing of the omnibus effort in the EU and what to do in the interim. I alluded to this, but for those who may have missed it, so the effort to consolidate all the EU reporting directives around ESG, the draft omnibus report is scheduled for February 26th, so later this month. And then it'll go through the ordinary process of review and consolidation. But in the meantime, what you're seeing is some of the first movers and the more ambitious member states that are prioritizing ESG still moving ahead with their national requirements around reporting and around compliance. So in the meantime, given the focus will still be on climate change, there'll still be a big push on ESG transparency. If you already are starting to look at the infrastructure you need to put in place, we continue to encourage you to do so. The things that are most likely going to be impacted are the reporting deadlines and the size of companies that are first caught in the reporting dragnet. Anyway, so yeah, we're waiting, we're observing, but it doesn't mean we're slowing things down. It's just a matter of seeing how the final verbiage is phrased. Okay, the next question is around HowGood's practices and whether it is fully aligned with CSRD compliance. I'm going to actually introduce a third speaker that you haven't yet met and whose face you're able to see, and that's Liz Aspley on our research team. She is our metrics architect and can tell you a lot more about our capabilities with respect to scopes 1, 2, and 3, as well as biogenic carbon dioxide and how we deal with baseline recalculations.
Hi, as Rami said, I'm Liz. For the climate portion of CSRD, all of HowGood's carbon emissions are calculated based on the GHG protocol. The CSRD requires either the ISO standard or GHG protocol for your corporate accounting. And so we are aligned there. Biogenic carbon emissions, the CO2 biogenic emissions should be reported separately, but calculated, which is something that our platform offers. Sorry, this was a series of questions. The final question in the series was
Baseline recalculations.
Thank you. How can you handle baseline recalculations? We allow you to have multiple years of carbon accounting data in our platform, as Joao showed. And so if for recalculating your emissions, you would have all of your activity data, you would enter it into the platform. If the recalculated emissions from your base year are material, if they exceed a threshold, then you would want to restate your base year emissions when you go to report those emissions.
Thank you, Liz. Joao, I'm going to turn it over to you. We've had questions around engaging suppliers in the supply chain. We even got a comment from someone saying it sounds quite daunting that they have to go engage hundreds, if not more, suppliers. My first question to you is, how do companies deal with these complex supply chains? And as a follow-up, how do they then ensure that the data that they're getting from these suppliers is consistent, actionable, and comparable for the procurement teams that are dealing with them?
Well, that's the $1 million question. But yeah, around complexity, the way we've been addressing the complexity issue here at HowGood is by creating a network that allows suppliers to share their product footprint data with multiple customers at once. Because part of the complexity is that every customer is asking upstream their supplier for sustainability information, and they use different templates, even though deep down they're actually asking for directionally the same type of data. And so at HowGood, our approach has been, okay, can we, through a software and automation system that allows suppliers to share the data seamlessly with not only one customer, but actually with dozens of customers at once, that can simplify a lot of the work. And so there is a specific framework and standard called the PACT standard, and HowGood also is aligned to the PACT standard. And it's basically a standard that oversees how we share footprint data to ensure that that footprint data is comparable and consistent across different vendors and suppliers, and that system boundaries and functional units are consistent. And so I think, how are we approaching the complexity? One, having a standard on sharing this type of data. Two, creating frameworks that enable suppliers to report to multiple customers at once. And third, and this is something that we do at HowGood, not just asking your supplier for data, but actually giving them a tool that enables them to calculate that footprint with precision. And so that's why within HowGood, we have a platform called Supplier Connect, that every company that is doing supplier engagement with HowGood gets access to that tool, the Supplier Connect tool. And the Supplier Connect tool is free and voluntary for their suppliers to use. And so this means that a supplier right now, if they want to report a footprint to that customer, and if they haven't calculated yet, they have a pretty intuitive solution to do so relatively quickly.
Great.
Did I miss anything, Ramya, on the question?
No, I was gonna, before you got to the Supplier Connect piece, I was gonna ask you to plug that, because we have identified this as a critical unlock for our customers and have been developing a lot of resources and tools for companies to address this very problem. So Joao obviously has gone through that in greater detail and can talk to you more if you are interested in that. I think we have time for one last question, but again, we are going to follow up with those of you whose questions didn't get enough time today. And that last question, I'll turn it back to you, Liz. We were talking about assurance practices as a component of CSRD compliance. How are we approaching Scope 3 assurance? Even with the GHG protocol as our North Star, there is some assumption baked into that methodology. So how do we square that up with the assurance practices that CSRD requires?
For the assurance processes, when you use our carbon accounting module within Lattice. We record all of the activity data that you've put in, and we have all of our emissions factors that are used to calculate the emissions also stored. And we have an audit trail essentially for anyone who wants to see, where did this number come from? Why is this emissions factor being used? Where did this emissions factor come from? And so on our end, we keep all of that available to help with any sort of audits. And we have helped folks through this in some capacity or another before. But in the GHG protocol allows you to make a lot of decisions around if you use spend-based, activity-based, average data-based calculations. And a lot of that data is also something that companies need to make sure that they have clear notes on, so they know where they sourced their own activity data, which is something else that we allow you to record in the platform.
Thank you, Liz. All right. I'll actually have time for one more question because we were able to sneak that one in there. The question is around how suppliers that are engaged in HowGood's platform, how is their data then shared with customers? And I think, Joao, you can talk us through a little bit more of the mechanics there so that people have a better visualization or understanding of that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because on one hand, you want to share the data with your customer who needs that data for the CSRD report. On the other hand, that data point is calculated based on formulation data and procurement data that is confidential and that is part of the intellectual property of your company. And so what HowGood does is your supplier submits their data to calculate the footprint. If they have an existing LCA, they can upload it. If they don't have it, they can use Supplier Connect to build their product and calculate the footprint super quickly. And then when they click publish or share, that product gets to be reviewed. If there is a specific LCA, it gets to be reviewed by one of our LCA experts like Liz, that kind of make sure that the quality is there, that it meets basic quality criteria in terms of system boundaries, functional units, and allocation rules. And then it becomes available to the customer, but the customer only sees the name of the product, the name of the supplier, and the footprint results. They're not able to see, the formulation or, the data about your specific suppliers. Where do you source the products from, or the actual ingredients that you're using? And so HowGood operates a little bit like a firewall that enables you to still share the sustainability data while protecting confidential and IP for your company.
I love that you focus on that, Joao, because as the company lawyer, that's another thing that, I do in my role. We understand that we're housing and working with some of the most sensitive information that our customers have as part of their business operations and their competitive advantage. So it's really important to us that we maintain the confidentiality, the information security, and the IP protections that give users confidence that, they're not sending off their important information into the ether. With that note, I am going to pause. I'm going to end our conversation here, engaging as it has been. As I mentioned, our team will get back to those of you who we did not get a chance to talk to, and please feel free to reach out. We're really excited to work with many of you as you think about your compliance journey with CSRD and all these other regulations coming up this year and beyond. I hope you all have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, as the case may be. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.